What is Hollywood's obsession with producing movies and funding movies where the storyline focuses on the time period when black people were enslaved?
Because they want black people to be conditioned to emotionalism. See, 55 years ago, when I was active in student and community affairs, myself, along with other people, we used to travel around the country to various college and university campuses, and we heard this group of people that was dedicating themselves to a lifetime of infiltrating and taking over the entertainment industry, the news industry, and politics so they could get their way of life imposed. Essentially, let's just put them as man haters. There were those who hated that they weren't men. There are those who hated men. There were those who hated they weren't strong men. There were those who hated that they weren't normal men. And there were those who hated that men supposedly caused war. So you had all of these people who did not match up to what would be termed the masculine standard, or who felt they were victimized by that. So they swore they were going to get rid of this. I can remember the first time I heard it, which was actually April 1967. People talking about masculinity is toxic and we're going to have to get rid of it for the salvation of humankind before we all kill each other off and nuke the world and all this kind of nonsense. So it went on from there. And I have seen this process of glorification of dysfunction so long that it has become normal. Now, I studied propaganda, and one of the targets of propaganda is to get your object to start thinking in terms of the propaganda that you're putting out. And compared to 50 some years ago and what I hear now, the process has been very successful because people express themselves and use the terms of the propaganda that has been directed against them. See, when you have the masculine component, it's about order, rationality, reason, logic, skepticism. It's about being rigorous in analyzing things. It's about a sense, an innate, instinctive sense that the thing between being a nice, tasty dish for another large predator on this planet and ruling the planet is putting your head into what you're doing, where you look carefully at the sign that you're seeing on the ground and around in the trees and what you're observing to keep from getting eaten, to find something to eat, and to keep your people from being lunch, breakfast, midnight snack to something large with a large appetite. Now everything on the planet is at our mercy, and what is it? Save the elephants, save the whales, save the tigers, send $19 a month to World Wildlife Fund, send $19 a month to ASPCA so poor Oscar won't be chained in the cold backyard and not no love. Send $19 a month to save a Negro because they're being so badly mistreated. You know, it's kind of getting weird when you look at it and say, man, I never thought it. I was hoping it wouldn't get this far, but I kind of knew it was going to, because we bought into it. It's like preachers now. They don't preach about sin, they talk about belief. You used to hear the perils of doing wrong and how you'd go to hell, and now you hear it's all right to be a pimp, hoe, drug dealer, murderer, thief, robber, rapist, burglar. It doesn't make any difference as long as you believe you're okay. So nobody preaches about the consequence of wrongdoing. You don't see somebody producing a dramatic work where somebody suffers because they did wrong, or doing right but having to suffer as a matter of principle, a tragedy. you hear all of this glorification of the wrong thing. Now, as far as black folk are concerned in the Hollywood industry, it started off in the late 1960s. Color television was beginning to work. First, they had these round screen things that weren't crap, and then they started getting square. They started working. And Hollywood at that time, every Sunday and every Thursday would come up with 2 new movies, 3 cartoons, and some little special reels at every theater in the country. No matter how well it was selling, it would change every Thursday and Sunday. And the movie industries were going broke trying to make that production schedule. So they got the idea, the folk that decided they were going to change the paradigm socially of taking over Hollywood, and what they came up with is, instead of doing 2 movies every Thursday and Sunday, we do just 1 and play it as long as people will come to see it. Also, instead of you walking in the middle of a movie, staying through what was showing, seeing the next one, and then sitting through what you missed to staying all night for 50 cents as an adult, let's charge $1.50, which we thought was outrageous, for 1 movie, and you had to go in there on time and leave when it was over. So what are we going to do, they said, about bringing in cash flow? Well, let's go to a group of neglected viewers who are anxious to see themselves, black folk. Well, let's not get one of those Sidney Poitier Moody movies or such that we had where they were talking about principle. Let's go to the lowest common denominator. Let's talk about drug dealers, pimps, hoes, and all that other kind of stuff, and get the most cash flow. So the first time we saw this was Fred the Hammer Williams in Black Caesar, where the hero was a contract killer and a drug kingpin, and he prospered, and he drove off in a limo smoking a big cigar as the sun rose after a shootout in a Long Beach warehouse with dead folk all over the place and no LAPD coming along. Everybody said, what is this? Wait a minute. We're talking about drug dealing being an anathema for the black community, and the Panther Party, Black Student Alliance, and all of these community organizations are trying to get drugs the hell out and resist the attempt to have an influx of heavy drug. What is this? And then 18 months later, they come up with Superfly. Rod O'Neal goes in there, and, you know, everybody had afros, beards, subdued, olive drab, tan, dark brown, or black dashikis, Levi's, boots.
The perm came back in bright colors.
Yeah, the perm comes back in, Superfly nonsense, pimp mobiles. Yeah, man, we're going to have to move some of that coke, man. That's deep, man. And I can remember it came out in LA in 1971, but in 1972 I was doing an intern thing at a think tank in DC, Washington. And my roommate and I were driving along. We were on 14th Street where they still had a movie house black folk went to. So we drove around this long block and had black folk in line coming out of the show where they'd bought a ticket, around to the far end of the short end of the block, down the long side of the block, around the short end, back up the long side, and back to the theater waiting to get in to see this poison. And everybody was talking about how deep it is.
What about these slavery movies, though? Why do you think
the slavery movies are part of getting you conditioned to being emotional and get you to go, woe is me, we've been done so wrong. So when you start talking about
victim talk, then
yeah.
All right.
So when you start talking about, oh, woe is me, I've been done wrong, they present it to you as an excuse rather than as a motivation to get angry enough to do something. Now, I stopped after I got past what Hollywood did as a for instance, and I'm going to get to that one. What you get is an excuse for not doing what you ought to do. I knew Japanese guys when I grew up on the West Coast, and see, some of them had kinfolk who were in Japan in World War II. And they were kamikazes, or they knew kamikazes. They were into that Bushido thing. They were into that bonsai charge. And in other words, they understood that you always had an option, that is to die by your own hand or by your action. And when I think about what was going on, when I think about my Native American side, which is grandmother saying, you colored get mad at what white folk do to you. We take scalps and nail them to the lodge pole and smile. I get to thinking about, they've done a damn fine job of what they're doing. And I go back to when I was an intern at this DC think tank in '72 here in DC, or in DC and in Chicago. And I think about what I read when I studied what they call the slave pamphlets that are on microfilm, or were in the Library of Congress. And it was get the slave to think in terms of his enslavement. So his culture teaches him that those things that we need him to be, that we need him to think like, are appropriate. In other words, get him thinking like a slave. Make sure he thinks he's dependent. Make sure he thinks he has to ask. Make sure he thinks that he should be grateful. Those three things. And you see, now we don't think like we did back in the 60s, like, get the hell out of my way, I'll do it for my damn self. It's, when are you going to give it to us? And then you see that gets back into, do you really expect somebody that's been oppressing you for hundreds of years to give you something that you are supposed to be able to ensure that you get? You see, the institution of slavery is particularly bad in America because it's chattel slavery, and that chattel is French for cattle. In other words, you dehumanize the slave. Previously, anybody might be a slave if he was unfortunate enough to get captured in a war. But here, the slave becomes a domestic animal, sort of a super chimpanzee or gorilla that walks on two legs, but is no more human than those animals are. You see, we even glorify the process, the woman king. That's out of Dahomey. The whole damn business was about slave catching. As a matter of fact, my great-grandfather, through the writings of my grandfather, is revealed to me, was very disturbed about the Dahomean thing. He was out on a mission patrol and he got captured, which is how he got sent over here after the slave trade. There were no woman kings in Dahomey. What happened is they had three brothers, literally kin, who would jointly inherited the kingship in Dahomey. So they came up with a brilliant idea. They said, we're not going to let our nobility hold these government posts. We get commoners. And for every commoner that holds a government post, we're going to have a beloved female relative of his in the palace is a concubine to one of us. And if that guy gets out of hand, we kill the female relative. We also throw in a little thing by allowing the female relative to veto what her male relative, who holds the official position, is talking about doing. So they had basically a battalion of Amazons, and everything else was run by men. So the whole movie was a lie, but the point of the exercise is so sickening is they glorified this very sordid event in our history of so many black folk getting enslaved around the world. And one of the centers was Dahomey, where the Dutch, the French, and to an extent the English financed this slave catching for several centuries. It didn't stop until the early part of the 20th century, and they were trying to bootleg it then. So that's like, let's say, women feminists deciding they wanted to show these heroic operatives in World War II who were females, so they're Jewish, and they pick Gestapo agents, female, who might have had a remote Jewish connection to glorify because they caught so many Jews and helped send them to the extermination camps. See, that's what that movie does, and it's part of that process of glorifying dysfunction and getting the targets of your propaganda going rah, rah, rah to something that's designed to hurt them.